So thanks again for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. We're very grateful that you're joining us as we continue to work hard to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC faculty, staff, and alumni experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this afternoon featuring UIC Associate Professor of Civil, Materials, and Environmental Engineering, Dr. Sybil Dirable. Sybil will talk us through how our cities work today and what we can expect in the future. We're really excited that he's here today and is joining us, and I'll turn it over to you to begin the program.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much. Please feel free to ask questions during. You'll see I have quite a few slides. If I go too fast, just let me know. If I don't go fast enough, also let me know. I'm just very pleased to be here today. And what I'll try to do is really to go over everything that you're using because of the pandemic right now when you're on lockdown. How does that work? When you open your tap, how does the water, where does it come from? How is it treated? Where does it go? When you switch on your computer or on the wall, where does that electricity come from? And I was told that I was going to present myself. And so the one thing I would like to do before I start my presentation is to tell you a little bit about myself, and especially about what I'm from. Let me see, can you see that, the Google Map? You can't see the Google Map? I knew that happens sometimes. So I'll stop sharing, I'll share again. That happens sometimes. All right. How about now? Can you see the Google Map? Still not?
No, we cannot see it.
All right, so it's too bad. I'll just go and start telling you where I'm from. I'm French, but I'm not from mainland France. France has tons of islands everywhere in the world. It's got a tiny, tiny one close to Canada and the US. It's on the East Coast. So it's called Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. Saint-Pierre for like Saint Peter, and Miquelon, and it's French owned. So we have the euro. It's 220 volts. I have a French passport. But I'm from a tiny island of 6,000 people. And so looking at cities and territories and islands, everything, looking at how water, electricity, transport, everything works together is something that I've had to do core forever, just because I'm from an island, we had to be independent. And so for me, it's always been very important to look at all the systems together. All right, here's the first slide. Can you see the first slide? Wonderful. So what we'll do today is try to understand that. So that's Chicago. That's a nice satellite view. We can see the loop. We can see the loop is right here. We can see the Jardine treatment plants. So we're going to talk about it a little bit here. We can see some substations. I think there's the Stickney wastewater treatment plant is here. We're going to try to understand that a little bit. To be a bit more precise, we're going to look at several infrastructure systems. We're going to look at water. We're going to look at wastewater. We're going to look at transport. We're going to look at electricity. We're going to look at gas. We're going to look at solid waste, and we're going to look at telecom. And then we'll talk a little bit about the future. But we'll have quite a big agenda. We're going to go over 7 infrastructure systems. So again, I'll try to be quick, but not that quick. And I'll try to at least show you things that are relevant to what you're doing. And we'll go in that order. So we'll start with water right now. So when we're thinking about water, and when I say water, I don't mean wastewater, I don't mean storm water. I mean, really just when you open your tap, how does water get there? There's 3 things that you'll have to do. The first thing is we have to collect water from somewhere, then we have to treat it, and then we have to distribute it. All right, so I'm gonna go over these 3 one by one. Water collection, if you're lucky, like we are lucky right here in Chicago, you have tons of surface water right where we live. So here in Chicago, we're very lucky because we're on the lake, on the shores of Lake Michigan. Sometimes you have access to a big river. We just have tons and tons of water. The way it's done in Chicago is actually pretty neat. You have you have cribs, like the one that you're seeing now in the picture, about 2 miles outside of, just in the lake. And it's a little bit outside to make sure that we don't collect the water that's by the shores that's going to be polluted. And then there were tunnels were dig beneath the lake, so beneath the riverbed. And so then you have a big tunnel that goes from the crib all the way to the Jardine treatment plant that's around the pier. That's where the water comes from, is uplifted, and then we're going to talk about treatment after. So that's when you're lucky, when you have a lot of surface water. Otherwise, it's actually way more groundwater than surface water. So using pumps to pump water up from the ground and then treat it is also very, very common. About 30% of all the freshwater reserve in the world are in the ground, and most of it, close to 70%, are in the ice caps. So many cities actually pump water from the ground. I'm not going to go over how that works. We have two types of aquifers, but that's just one of the sources of water. And the last one, which is becoming more and more common, is the sea. It becomes, you have more, the cities are getting bigger, but sources of water are not getting bigger. So sometimes we have to be creative. And for the longest time, it was very difficult to get water from the sea and purify it, but now we're becoming better and better at it. The picture I'm showing now of you is well, the picture I'm showing right now is of Singapore. And I lived there for a year. It's a fantastic place. I highly recommend you go. What I want to highlight here is that the buildings here, do you see those three towers there? All that land there that you can see, all that did not exist 50 years ago. Singapore is tiny, so they're incredibly good at reclaiming land. So they get a lot of rocks and sand from, especially Indonesia, but other places as well. They infill in the water, and then they literally build land on water to expand their territory. So all of that didn't exist. Before the shores was right here. That's the Fulton Hotel. Fulton or Fulton. I never know now because I'm in Chicago. It's a Fulton Market and Fulton Road. But right there. But all of that is reclaimed land. All of this that you see here, that's now a freshwater reservoir. So Singapore is so small, they actually import a lot of water from Malaysia. And so they are trying to have a lot of reservoirs around the island. So every single river and lake, all that becomes a freshwater reservoir, and even built one into the sea. But now that's fresh water. And then if we look a little bit to the left, there's actually a dam, there's a barrage, and that's the barrage between the ocean and the reservoir. So they do treat the water from the reservoir the conventional way, but also pump water directly from the ocean in desalination plants. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So the first thing is we need water, right? To have water, you need to collect water from somewhere. Surface water is great if it's there. That's what we have in Chicago. You have also the ground. So a little bit more of the suburbs actually pump a lot of water from the ground. And then in some places, Singapore is one. Israel, they're amazing as well at desalinating seawater. Once we've got the water, we're going to have to treat it. And I want to go over water treatment now fairly quickly. Water treatment is something I didn't know about for the longest time. It's actually really cool. And the principle of water treatment is not that complicated. It's to remove the big stuff first and the small stuff last. So we're going to import water, for example, from Lake Michigan. First, we're going to have a few screens. With the screens, we're going to get all the fish out, or we're going to get all the pieces of wood out, everything, so that water is fairly clear, but it's still going to be a little bit muddy. Once that mud is there, what we want to get rid of that mud. And the problem is that it's very fine, it's floating, and all those little particles, especially clay, for example, they're all charged with a negative, they're all negatively charged, which means that when they get together, they push each other, they push one another like magnets. When you take two magnets from the same poles, you can't, it doesn't stick. It's actually being, it's like kind of ejecting. So it's the same thing. So what we do is first we put a coagulant. Once we put the coagulant, that the negative part is neutralized. Once it's neutralized, then the little particles start to clump together. Those clumps are called flux. And so first we have, here we have coagulation. We add something, so then the coagulation happens. Then we mix it fairly slowly, so those clumps form. And then after some time, those clumps are so big that they just rest at the bottom here of a basin. So then it's pretty clear, but there's still little things that are left. So after that, what we'll do is we have the water go through filtration. Filtration is not a filter like this. Usually you have a big bed of sand or anthracite or something very fine, and then the water just trickles through. And when it comes out of it, it's clean. Then it's ready to be drunk. What we do is we added a little bit more disinfectant to make sure that it's disinfected, and to make sure that that disinfectant is also there in all the pipes when it's being distributed after, so that there's no contamination. So the process is fairly easy, and it's fairly straightforward. It's a lot easier than I thought when I first learned about it. I thought it was going to be very complicated chemistry, but it's not most of the time. Sometimes, of course, you have some problems with other contaminants, so you need to add other processes to remove some other things. But otherwise, it's fairly straightforward. What you have in the end is water that's also, especially in Chicago, we have hard water. So hard water means that you have a lot of minerals in the water. And that's usually good for humans. I mean, we need minerals. I always say, if you drink pure water, if you drink distilled water, like sometimes you can buy that in the store, especially for your iron. If you just drink that, you're not going to process it. You're just going to pee it right away, because you need those minerals to be able to keep that water level. So I always say same thing. If you have a big party at night, so now it's probably not going to be outside, it's probably going to be indoors. But if you have a big party and you wake up the day after with a nice headache, don't just drink water. You need some minerals. So either you eat something to get those minerals, or you drink some Gatorade or something that has all those salts, those nice salts that are there to keep you hydrated. That's also why when you think about when they desalinate seawater, so the salt there is diluted in the water. So removing it is difficult. So what they do instead is they actually have a membrane with tiny pores, and they push the water through the pores, and nothing gets through except pure water. So all the salt stays on one side, and all the pure water goes through on the other side. But what they do is before they distribute that in the system, so for example, in Singapore or in Israel, they remineralize it. So they actually add some minerals to it, and some they think are important before distributing it. So that's water treatment for you. It can be complicated if you're dealing with very contaminated water, or it can be fairly simple. In Chicago, we're very lucky because the water quality is actually not that bad, especially 2 miles off. And so that conventional process works well. After water is treated, it's time to distribute it. And that's where you have those pumps. So in some places, I'm going to show you water tower because it's actually still working in Chicago. In some places, when they have a lot of hills, they have the water treatment up the hill, and then this way gravity just pushes all the water in the system. Where I'm from, in St. Pierre and Miquelon, that's what we have. We have a few lakes at fairly high level. We get water to a water treatment plant, and then all the houses are below the water treatment plant. So gravity just does its thing. Chicago is flat as can be, right? I mean, you cannot do more flat in Chicago, so we need those pumps. So we have a few pumps, not that many. I think it's about 12 pumps in Chicago, and they get all that pressure all the time in the system, in the water pipes, to make sure that, again, when you open your tap, water is flowing out. I want to show here water tower because it's still working. See that door here that we can see? That's actually open and you can't get in. There's a very famous theater that's great, but if you just open it, you can actually see the pumps inside. And I say that because every time I have visitors coming to Chicago, we all, of course, have to go to Michigan Avenue. And of course, I have to bring them there, and I open it and I show them how great the pumps are, and nobody cares except for me. Someone told me once that engineering was a lifestyle, not a profession. I believe that. I mean, I really get intrigued and interested in things that many people don't have any interest in. I still push them to the pumps because I think they're really cool. So just go and you'll see them. They're massive. It's incredible. And it's thanks to those pumps that you have water whenever you open your tap. So that's water distribution. Roughly, that's how you get your water. We collect it from somewhere, we treat it, and we distribute it. The way that we're doing it right now is good, but it's got some problems because, again, those pressure, that pressure always have to be there in those conduits, in those pipes. And so whenever you have water main breaks, that's when, sometimes you need to shut water for entire neighborhoods. Or even in Texas right now, they were not like Chicago. In Chicago, we're clever enough that we put our pipes below the frost line, so water cannot freeze if it's below the ground. In most places, when it's warm, they don't need to dig that deep, so they just put the water a little bit so above the frost line. And so whenever you have very cold temperatures, then you can have the water can freeze, and you can have some pipes breaking, which is a big problem. But that's water. So now you know exactly how when you open your tap, drink your water. And by the way, water from the tap is good. We're very lucky to live in a country where normally in most places in this country, when you can drink tap water, I certainly drink tap water, and it's usually the quality is better than bottled water because water in bottled water stayed in plastic for a long time. I'm not a water chemist, so don't ask me exactly why in terms of chemistry, but I know that, and I know I'm a very proud drinker of tap water. And I don't have lead in my house. Anyway, that's another discussion. After we talked about water collection, water treatment, water distribution, we can go and talk about wastewater. It's actually pretty funny because all the way until it gets to your tap, water is directed, all the regulations is about the Safe Drinking Water Act. All the way it gets to your tap. You open your tap, some water just falls about a few inches to the bottom of the sink, and all of a sudden it's a completely different world. As the Clean Water Act. I always forget the name, but the Clean Water Act. And now we're not talking about water anymore. We're talking about wastewater. And you have two types of wastewater. One is sanitary wastewater. So whatever falls in your sink, whenever you flush that toilet, or whenever you take a shower, all of that is sanitary wastewater. And the second one is storm water. And storm water is whenever it rains. So whenever it rains, water has to go somewhere. And what's happened is that in cities now, we've become really good at living together. And so we have enormous cities. And for the cities to function, we have buildings that are made of concrete, we have roads that are made of asphalt and pavement, and those surfaces are impermeable, as in water falls and it can't go through. So in nature, water falls, it can seep through the ground, it's getting used by the trees. So, the water stays there, or otherwise it flows to the rivers. And it's sort of fine. In cities, what we have is an influx of water that's there that has to go somewhere. That water just uses gravity to go somewhere. When it goes somewhere, usually you do it in such a way that it goes to the sewer system. Except that sometimes your sewer system was built a long time ago, and so it easily gets overwhelmed. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit now. So what I want you to do is imagine that you're the mayor of Chicago in 18 something or early 1900s. What you have is, you always have storm water. So what we're going to do is to build some stormwater drains. So we're just going to put some pipes maybe below the road or ditches, and we're just all the water from the storms are going to go there, all the storm water. And then all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but then people need water. You start to build water distribution systems. You even treat your water. People use water because it's available, because it's so easy. They use a lot of water, and then you have to put that water somewhere. Before we had cesspools in the basements or in the backyards, that was enough because we didn't consume much water. Once we had tons of water available to us, we just started to consume a lot of it. So where do you put it? You have two choices. Either you build a separate system and you have new drains and new pipes, et cetera, to contain all that sanitary wastewater. Or you say, well, I have those drains already there for my stormwater. I can just connect all the houses, all the buildings to that drain that's already there. And then I have one system for two. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's what most old cities did. And when you have that, you have what's called a combined sewer system. It's combined because it's combined sanitary and combined stormwater system. So here, this is a typical case in Chicago where you have a house here and you have people use water. Then it goes at the bottom of the house, and it's always because we use gravity, so below the house, and then you have a pipe that goes to the sewers. At the same time here are the streets. The streets, they're never flat. They look flat sometimes, they're not. They're always arced a little bit so that water goes naturally to the gutters. And then from the gutters, they go to catch basins, and then from catch basins, they go to the sewers. And so you see that when it rains a lot, not only do we have all the sanitary sewer that come all the time, we also have the storm water that comes there as well. And that's actually a big problem. And that leads to something called combined sewer overflow. So we actually suffer from that very often in Chicago, where the sewer system is completely full. And so what happens is that a lot of that combined sewer, a lot of that raw sewage is just being put in the Chicago River, just completely raw, untreated, which is a very, very large problem. In many cities that have that problem, combined sewer system, it's not only Chicago. We'll talk about some solutions. But now all cities, as far as I know, all new cities know that it's a big mistake to have a combined sewer system. So they all go to separate sewer system route. And that's what it looks like. And it's really, you just have two different channels, one underground for all the sanitary sewer and one underground for all the stormwater sewer. And the stormwater sewer, usually you can just dispose of that directly and back in the environment. You don't need to treat it, as opposed to the sanitary sewer that always goes to a wastewater treatment plant. So now you have to think, you have to wonder, what do I do? My my sewer system is blocked. I have way too much water when when it rains. What do I do? What do I do? In the 1950s and 60s, people in Chicago were wondering that, and the solution that they came up with was the TARP system. I don't know if you have heard about it. Here's an old illustration. The TARP is the tunnel and the reservoir plan. So what they do is, again, that system, that pipe gets full. So a lot of it is just being disposed directly in the environment, in the Chicago River, which we don't want because that water is polluted, it's contaminated. So what they decided to do is to build massive underground tunnels, bigger than subways, bigger than the blue line or the red line when you go downtown. And that's what we see here. All the overflow, instead of going to the Chicago River, for example, goes to a large shaft that's underground. Again, massive. All of these go in one direction. You have to store that extra sewage, and then they go to old quarries. And then old quarries are there, so they're just massive bowls that are there, and then all the water is just disposed there. And it stays there for a while until the rain is over. And when the rain is over, bit by bit, it's being pumped back to wastewater treatment plants. It's being treated, and then it's being disposed back in the environment, like in the Chicago River, and then it goes to the Mississippi River, et cetera, et cetera. That's an overly engineered technique. It's typical of the 1960s and 1970s. Right now, we do things differently, or we try to do things differently, or we try to have multiple strategies. Um, the thing that people realize, I don't know, maybe in the 1990s, especially 2000s, is that the first problem, I mean, what was the problem? Is the problem that we don't know what to do with that water? We can't get rid of it quickly enough? No, the real problem is that those surfaces are impermeable, right? It's all concrete, it's all asphalt, water falls, it has to go somewhere. It can't go through the concrete, it can't go through the asphalt, so it's just going to follow the land. So what we've been doing, what the engineering profession has been doing, especially in the past 15 years, is to make surfaces that used to be impermeable to make them more permeable. A great example right here in Chicago is Argyle Street. So I don't know if you like Vietnamese food. I'm a big fan of Vietnamese food. Actually, 2 years ago, I spent 6 months in Vietnam. It was an amazing time. So what you do is you tear up that pavement, and here you put, so there's that green, these are planters that's there, but even the pavers, look at the pavers all there. All the pavers, they're not directly stuck to one another. There's a little space between them. And that's because this way water can actually go through, and the subgrade, you have gravel with a lot of void, and so it can retain a lot of water there instead of putting in the sewers. And that works really well. That's green infrastructure. It's called green infrastructure or low impact development. So here, a lot of water just goes below, so between in the cracks of the pavement, it stays there. When that gets full, it goes in the planter. The planter keeps a lot of water as well. And when the planters are full, then it goes to the sewer system. And that's the way that you can keep that water on surface as opposed to going to the sewer directly. Similarly, when you go to a street curb, and you see after it rains, a street curb is completely flooded. They're like, that catch basin is full, something is not working, you have to call the city, maybe it's blocked, it's not working. That's actually not true. It's actually working pretty well, because what they've done is you put a restrictor plate in the catch basin. So it's a little hole so that not much water can go in. And so what you're doing is artificially flooding the streets a little bit instead of that water going in the sewers. Because if it goes in the sewers, it might lead to overflow, or it's going to lead to sewer backups. Some of you might have experienced sewer backups in the past. I've never, and I don't want to experience that. And so flooding the streets as a temporary solution is preferable than having sewer backups. If you want to see great examples of green infrastructure, that's an amazing one in Argyle if you want to get some Vietnamese food, or if you're around UIC, you can go to UIC. We have amazing green infrastructure on UIC campus itself. So just by Lincoln Hall, you can see some permeable pavers, exactly like the ones you're seeing there. And I actually like it, because if you're coming from the subway station, from the UIC Halsted L station toward the quad, you either can take one of those old paths that's made of concrete, or you can look right by Lincoln Hall and you're going to see that those permeable pavers. And when it rains, you'll see that on that concrete, you're going to have a lot of ponds of water. It's going to be mucky. You're going to have all the grass that's there with a lot of mud that's going to be there. Or you can just walk on the pavers, and those pavers are normally very dry because all the water just seeps through directly. So it works really, really well. And by the way, grass is not green infrastructure. Grass is terrible because it's got such small roots that doesn't get that much water. So a little bit of water goes in, it soaks all the soil, and becomes muddy very, very quickly, and then the water just runs off to wherever the land brings it. As opposed to what we call native plants, and native plants are like the ones we're seeing here, so they're larger. We call them native plants because they're native to North America, as opposed to grass that's a luxury that was imported from Europe. So they're big, they have deep roots. All those deep roots actually retain all the water there, and so you don't have as much flooding. So these types of green infrastructure low impact development are transforming cities in the world. Every city is going through, in very dry areas. Most cities and many cities in the world are going through intense rains, intense storms, and they're really dealing with urban flooding problems. And green infrastructure is changing cities everywhere. So I've seen many projects going on in China, going in Vietnam, going in Singapore, going in Europe, going in South America, going in America and Canada, really just about everywhere. And it's phenomenal because not only do they have some benefits in terms of stormwater management, they also, there's some greenery that tend to be nicer, tend to be more pleasing. So in terms of economic development in the area, it tends to work better just because it's nicer. It also promotes biodiversity. It also helps treat wastewater a little bit. There's really, it's all positive with green infrastructure. So I can only recommend that if you have any problems, urban flooding problems in your area, just push the city to install some green infrastructure projects. So that's it. That's all we're going to talk about wastewater treatment. About what wastewater, we're actually not going to talk about wastewater treatment, but it works in a relatively similar way to water treatment, which is you remove the big stuff first and the greases and the fine stuff later. We just don't treat it in such a way that it's drinkable at the end. When it's good enough, it's being disposed in the in nature, and then nature just does its thing, and it just further treats it by itself. Now, the next thing I want to go to is transport. Now we know about water, we know about wastewater. I want to go to transport. And I like transport a lot. And originally I was more of a transport person. And the first thing I want to say is look at this picture. All right, we have that's the Kennedy Expressway. I think it's the Kennedy Expressway. Yeah, it is, because we've been to O'Hare. No, Eisenhower. I never know. I don't have a car, so I never know how they're called. I think it's the Kennedy Expressway. Look at all that traffic. And what I want to ask you is, do you think that makes sense? Look at all the roads that we have here in the US. Should we have traffic like this? I personally, I find it absurd. It's not normal to have that much space dedicated to roads, to have that many lanes, to have that many expressways, and to have that level of congestion. So I want to ask you, how do you ease traffic congestion? How do you make traffic congestion like this not a reality anymore? Is the answer to build more roads? That's always what I hear. More roads. I hear about people say, oh, we have a shoulder. Why don't we turn that shoulder into a lane, and then we have more space, and then with more space, we're not going to have as much congestion. Well, let's look through it a little bit. We really have two solutions when you think about congestion. The number one solution is to increase the supply. So when I mean increasing the supply, it means adding new lanes, adding new roads, adding new bridges, adding new tunnels. The boring company by Elon Musk that I don't like at all, by the way, we can talk about that after. That's one solution. The other solution is to reduce the demand. So reduce the demand. What's demand? So then we can think about what is demanded, right? When you're traveling, what do you demand from the transport infrastructure? And really, when you think about it, what you're demanding is not what you're demanding really is a space. That's what you're demanding. What you want is space. You want some space for you over time, over a certain length. So it's either you're gonna, take a car and drive 2 minutes to go somewhere. You're going to take some space. You use your car to go an hour somewhere. Or you're going to use some space, or you're going to take transit, or you're going to use bike. But it's all about the space that you take. And so really what we're running out of when there's traffic congestion is space. So if you want to ease traffic congestion, you can increase the supply, but we've increased it so much. There's actually something called induced demand, which is that by adding more and more roads, and you can apply that to a lot of things, but in transportation, by adding more and more roads, at the beginning, traffic is better because all of a sudden you have more space. But very quickly, because that space is there now, you have what's called induced demand. So you're creating more demand, so more people use it. So instead of looking at it like this, think about where you need, what you're demanding. What you're demanding is space, and think about what's taking the most space. So here's a picture of about 60 people. So you have 60 people in a bus. That's what you have here on the left. Then 60 people biking right here in the middle, and then 60 people in cars here on the right. And so that's why, when you want to ease traffic congestion, I know with COVID-19, a lot of people don't want to take transit, and transit is a place where germs are shared. I personally still use transit. I always wear my mask. I always wash my hands, but I still use transit. And if you want to ease traffic congestion, if you're tired of traffic congestion, think about space. Here's another picture that I like. This is from some politicians in I think it was in Vienna, in Austria. I think they were pro biking, and so they decided to bike and to just have that around them as if they were taking as much space as cars were. And you just see how different it is. So how much space a pedestrian or a cyclist take as opposed to a car. So and of course transit is a huge it's one of the biggest things you can do when you want to ease traffic congestion, because people take less space. So right now, again, you have to be very careful with COVID, always wash your hands, et cetera, but transit is really the answer. It's never more roads, not in the US. Maybe in places, in some countries where cities are growing more and more, when you're going from 1 million people to 3 to 5 to 10 million, maybe then you need more roads. But otherwise, it's really transit is the answer, as well as more walking and more biking. I know talking about safety, one of the other things I'd like to raise is safety, safe transportation is very, very, very important. How do you ensure that people are safe in transportation? The obvious answer is, well, we're going to put bike lanes, we're going to put sidewalks, we're going to put, this is what you want, right? And then this way, cars are not going to hurt cyclists, cars are not going to hurt pedestrians. The answer might actually be the opposite. So there's actually that concept of shared space that's really taking over. And that shared space is that by segregating modes, what you're doing is cars actually going faster and they're not paying as much attention. As opposed to if you're sharing the space, so that's a place in London that's actually close to the school I went to for my undergrad, is that you have that spaces with no sidewalks, and then you have those big X's right there in the middle. So drivers actually have to pay attention. They have to be very, very careful. And that actually tends to be safer than when you have sidewalks and bike lanes, et cetera, because people don't pay attention as much. And that's a pretty interesting concept. So what I want to leave you with in terms of transportation, I can tell you more about how transit works and how we define transit lines, et cetera. But congestion is really the one thing we talk about. So my main takeaway here is always say yes to more transit investment. I have some people coming to me sometimes saying, well, my taxes go to transit. I don't like this. I don't use transit. I'm like, you're dumb. Because if those taxes don't go to transit, then people would drive instead. And if they drove instead, then you'd be even more stuck in traffic. So whether you're for transit or against transit, whether you use a car or you don't use a car, whatever it is, always say yes to transit. They actually had several referendums in Los Angeles to invest more money, to increase taxes, to spend more in transit, and always to say yes, because it's such a traffic nightmare that transit is the answer for long trips, for motorized trips when you can't just bike or walk, simply because, again, people use less space. So I just went over that with my students in class. Transit is better, and the reason why it is better, not even necessarily from an environmental perspective, it's just that people take less space. And at the end of transportation, what we need is space. All right, that's transportation for you. We can talk more about transportation if you want a little bit after. I want to move on to electricity. There's two things in electricity. There's generation and distribution. Generation, I'm sure a lot of you know already about generation, you know about types of technologies that we can use to generate electricity. The one thing that you should realize is that electricity doesn't exist in a raw form, at least very little of it, when thunderstorms or here and there, but it doesn't exist. And because it doesn't exist, in abundant quantities in raw form, we need to find some other type of energy that we transfer, that we convert to electricity. So in electricity, what we want is to find a lot of primary energy. And when we have that primary energy, then we're going to convert it. And you have tons of energy that we can harvest. Coal, oil, natural gas, phenomenal energy, super dense. We've been using it for the past 100 and more years. We should be very grateful of everything they've given to us. But they've also given us things that we like and things that we don't like climate change and more greenhouse gases. So we're going to have to shift away from fossil fuels. And that's when we're going to go to more renewable energy. And we call them renewable energy because they get renewed. And here are some examples. There's geothermal, biomass. So geothermal is from volcanic or whenever you have some geothermal activity going on, like in Iceland. Biomass is by burning trash or by burning crops or trees. Solar thermal is one that I like because people don't usually think about it. You all know about solar photovoltaics, so those solar panels. But what you can also do is just to have water. And then, you can either use the water heated with the sun and then use that as opposed to a water heater at home, or you can have water and have mirrors pointing to some water so that you create some steam and then you generate electricity as well. So thermal is one way to create energy. Nuclear is right there in the middle because nuclear is not sustainable. It's not renewable because we're still mining uranium and plutonium and we're going to run out of it exactly like coal, oil, and natural gas, but at least there's no greenhouse gases. So that's one of the big benefits of nuclear. Then we can have the traditional renewables. There's wind, there's tide, there's some waves. So wave and tide are becoming more and more bigger and bigger. Tide, we're actually just did a big thing about tide. So I think tide is going to be a big one in the future. The golden child of electricity generation is hydroelectric. So having dams, so you dam up a river, you flood what's behind, and then you use that force out of that energy to generate electricity. 4 out of the 5 biggest power plants in the world are hydroelectric power plants. The biggest one is the Three Gorges Dam in China, which I dream to visit at some point. And then we also have solar photovoltaic. But you know about generation. I'm sure most of you know something about generation. So what I want to talk about is more the distribution. And the way it works is once we've generated the electricity, then we distribute it first in those big power lines. I'm going to tell you more about those. These are the transmission lines. Then we have them to go to the substation. Then from the substation, we have them go through distribution lines. So that's the one that you're going to see in your back alleys when you see those wires. And then from that, it's going to go home. And so you have those 3: transmission lines, distribution lines, and then to your place. Or transmission, substation, distribution, then to your place. And now you have to realize something is that most of the time the way that we generate electricity is by turning something. we're turning a turbine and we're generating electricity. And when you're turning a turbine, you're generating electricity. You don't need to just provide one type of electricity. It's not just one current. You can build as much as you want. And here's a typical turbine. We have many different types of currents that we can build. But usually what we do, or actually, as far as I know, is everywhere, what humanity has decided to do in the past, maybe 150 years or 120 years, is to generate 3 currents. So every single motor, when you generate electricity, creates 3 currents. And those 3 currents are distributed in the grid. So we could do 4, 5, 6, but we've decided to be 3. 3 is actually nice because they can sort of balance each other a little bit. And that's why when you actually go and you look at every power line, you're always going to see 3. So 3 or 6. So here, that's a great example of a transmission system. You see phase 1, 1, 2, and 3. Sometimes you have 6 because it's just double 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The 2 or 1 that we have at the very top, that's a lightning protection. But otherwise, you always have 3. That's 3-phase power. And I tell you, it's phenomenal because I've seen that everywhere in the world. I've been in rural parts of Vietnam. I've been I know we were talking about Japan before, in Europe, and everywhere I go, I always see those 3 cables. And I think I could be wrong, but it's one of those things. It's one of the most universally accepted things that we've done as human beings. We don't have a common currency. We don't have the same voltage. We don't have the same pressure. There's a lot of things. We don't even have the same system. Somehow Americans don't like the metric system. I always say I don't understand it. The U.S. for the biggest, the most innovative nation in the entire world, they can't even use the metric system. And it's kind of like people are still talking the Sears Tower, the Sears Tower. At the beginning, I was like, all right, so it's not the Willis Tower, it's the Sears Tower. And at some point, I was like, no. Why you said, how it is such an innovative country? How are you set in your old ways? It's just called the Willis Tower. We're innovating. So at some point, the U.S. sort of have to move to the metric system. But the 3-phase power is something I've seen absolutely everywhere. And so it's incredible. And once you see it once, you cannot unsee it ever. So here, that's for the transmission lines. This is a picture that I found on Twitter. That's a substation that Comet is building. And you can see here, 1, 2, 3. So there's 3 phases that are coming to substations. And when they're, it's hard to do 3 with my fingers. I don't know how I can do it. You do them, then you see, so 3, then it's the voltage is going to be stepped down. And then we're going to go to a distribution line. That's actually not too far from where I live, where we have, again, always those 3 lines because it's 3-phase power. Then we have those sort of garbage bins, and these are transformers. So what we're doing there is, again, we're stepping down the voltage to be at 120 volts. And we're also shifting them away. So right now we have 3 lines. They're all 120 degrees apart, right? Because the total is 360. And we shift them away so that they're 180 degrees apart. So they're exactly opposite. And so what we do then is, if you go to your electric panel, you should see that you have always 2 sides here in the US, always 2 sides to your electric panel. Because out of the 3 phases, you actually get 2 phases at home. That's the way it works. And the nice thing about having 2 phases, and that's really the US and Europe, where they have 240 volts, they only have 1 phase coming. In the US, it's 2 phases. And the nice thing is that when you actually require a lot of power, you don't want your current to be too high. So instead of asking for 120 volts, if you put 1 phase to neutral, you get 120 volts. If you put 1 phase to the other phase, then you get 240 volts. And so this is actually an electric panel of one of my students a few years ago. And you can see that student had the AC system, had the double breaker. So that was working on 240 volts. The stove here clearly was electric because it worked on 240 volts. If you have a gas stove, usually it's just 120 volts because you're mostly using gas. And I think that's about it. So I would really encourage you right after this talk to go to your electric panel, open it up. You'll see the 2 phases. Don't mess up with it, but just look at where you have double breakers. And you'll see that the biggest appliances that you have that require electricity are going to have double breakers, like your AC. Some of you, maybe the stove. Some of you, maybe a washer, dryer, maybe, or the HVAC system, maybe if you have one. But I know here in the US, in Illinois, most of us have gas systems. So you're probably not going to have too many double breakers. But those appliances work with 240 volts. And again, you can't do that because you have those 2 phases. So don't mess up with it. Call an electrician if you want to do anything. But it's really cool. I rember being super happy when I opened my electric panel and seeing that. All right, gas. I'm going to go very, very quickly over gas because we just, we get it from the ground, we process it, we distribute it. The one thing I want to say is, in terms of for all of you who are environmentally friendly, right now in Illinois, it's preferable to use gas and electricity because the way electricity is produced actually requires a lot of fossil fuels. I know we had a lot of nuclear, but we also have a lot of I don't know if it's gas or coal, but the electric grid is not that clean in Illinois. So here it's better to have gas. But at some point, once the grid becomes cleaner, once the energy emissions related to the grid are lower, and this is the case, for example, in Massachusetts, I think, and in Vermont, where they get a lot of power from Canada, and it's all hydro, from Washington State, where there's also a lot of hydro. There, what you want is to power your home, your heat, et cetera, with electricity. Here, it's better to have gas. The other thing I want to say is that gas, something I learned actually recently, is that we import a lot of gas from places. And then what we do is we store it in the summer, we don't need it. And where do we store that gas? We actually store it in the ground. So we try to find some places in the ground, like aquifers or old gas wells, that have that nice rock that's there. And we just store the gas there in the summer, and then we pump it back up in the summer. And that has some problems because of leaks. And I don't want to talk too much about gas, but it's still a pretty cool infrastructure to learn about. When we talk about solid waste, I'm going to go very quickly about solid waste. I mean, you know those big trucks. I remember another thing again. I remember being in Barcelona, being in this nice, really nice little streets of Barcelona, finding that tiny truck, finding it so cute. I had to take a picture of it. I was there with my family. Nobody understood me. Barcelona is so nice. The only thing I take a picture of course, is a tiny garbage truck. That's to show you that, again, engineering is a lifestyle, it's not a profession. But the one thing I want to mention about solid waste is that the solid waste starts with you. It starts with you picking up an item, whatever it is. You pick something, it's like, oh, this now has no value for me, and it's solid waste. And so that's where it starts. And so that's when you're looking at integrated solid waste management, we're really trying to think about everything, including from the very beginning. But usually the way it goes is you're going to take something, you're going to say, this has no value to me now, I'm going to throw it away. That's one. Next, you're going to put it somewhere. So if you have recyclables from non-recyclables from composting, you might throw them away in separate bins. Then it's being collected, and then it's going to be transported and maybe processed and then disposed in the end. There's usually a hierarchy that we're going to follow. The first thing is try not to create waste if you can. If you do, try to reuse it. You can reduce or reuse it, and if not, try to recycle it. If it can't be recycled, throw it away. But what we're going to try to do is to recover some energy from it. In the end, is to treat it. I know it's 12:46. I'm going to go very quickly, but there's tons of things you can do. Of course, you know about the traditional recycling. Paper, glass, metal, plastic, and that's landfill. These are nice posters that come from the UIC Office of Sustainability. Composting is actually a type of recycling because you're transforming waste into something else. So that's what composting is. Aerobic composting, the real name is aerobic composting because you're using air to transform that waste into fertilized soil. But what you can also do is to take all that and put them in containers without air, and that's called anaerobic digestion. When you do that, you still have the same process happening, but instead of having that nice soil, you're also producing, in addition, you're producing some methane. That's natural gas, and we can actually burn that to create some heat or electricity. We don't really have that in the US. This is a big plant in Germany, but we don't really have that in the US. Something else that you can do with waste, especially waste from buildings, is to reclaim land. So I told you about Singapore before that really grew. That's a picture of Boston. That's the way it was in 1630s. That's the dark greens in 1630. And most of the Boston that you know now is all reclaimed land, including Back Bay. And a lot of that is just reclaimed land. So it's really just either it's excavating or using trash and not dirty trash, but it's reclaimed land. Even Ellis Island in New York City. Ellis Island, most of Ellis Island is actually rubbles that came from excavating New York City for the subway system. So all those rubbles had to go somewhere. You just throw them in the ocean, and then you create some new land, and that's what Ellis Island is like. Sometimes we also like to burn it. So we have some of those in the US, not that much. In Japan is a pro at burning waste. So you get that waste, you burn it. Well, everything that can be burned, you burn. So concrete and everything, you separate, you try to use it for something else. Everything that can be burned, you burn. When you burn it, you produce some heat and or electricity. And then what you're left is ash. In that ash, you might have some metals left, so you try to extract them. Otherwise, that ash, you can throw it away. And what actually they've done in Singapore and Japan, they've built new islands as well with those ashes that are left. So that's when you do waste to energy recovery. In the US, what we like a lot is to put everything in a landfill. So a landfill is really just a big dump to put everything. We try to do it very nicely by having a big tarp at the bottom, because when all that gets there, it's kind of like composting. It's macerating, it's decomposing. You have some liquid, it's called leachate, that's flowing to the bottom. And if you don't put a tarp, then it's actually going in the ground and you might contaminate groundwater. So we have nice tarp, so the leachate is contained. We have all the waste that's there, and then we cover it And because exactly like composting or like anaerobic digestion, it's all being decomposed, and that's also producing natural gas. So then we recuperate all that natural gas, and we can use it. So see here we see a leachate plant to recuperate that, to gather that leachate, and we also get that natural gas. So we do require quite a lot of it, but remember that there's that hierarchy. First, we try to reduce. If we can't reduce, then we try to reuse. If we can't reuse, then we try to recycle. If not, to recover, and then we'll just let it rot. In terms of telecommunications that we're looking at now, I'm going to go over it very, very quickly. I just have a couple of slides, but it's a fascinating, fascinating world. I just learned about it recently. I learned a lot about analog telecommunications and digital telecommunications. It's incredible how we can talk, and I can stream this now in real time. It's just about incredible. I would like to show you this. Here, I want to show you the Willis Tower, not the Sears Tower. I want to show you the Willis Tower. And I want to show you that's been a telecommunication antenna from the beginning. And I want to show you those white rectangles there that are vertical. Those are your cell towers, and they're absolutely everywhere. It's incredible. Once you start to pay attention, just go and walk, look up, you're going to see them. They're absolutely everywhere. It's really incredible. And the way it works and the way the internet works is really cool. I know I don't have time now, it's 12:50, but at some point maybe I can tell you about it. The other thing I want to mention is that almost everything I've told you about now, I'm actually writing a book about that for everyone. I do have a book now. It's a textbook. That's very nice, but it's got a lot of equations. It's kind of scary for people who are not engineers. I'm trying to right now I'm writing a trade book, just really for everyone. If you're interested to know about anything, just ask me. I can share some chapters with you absolutely for free. I would just ask you not to distribute it, and hopefully to get some feedback from you if something is not understandable. But just email me, and I can tell you more about analog telecommunications or digital telecommunications or natural gas or water, wastewater transport. The last thing I want to know now is to talk to you a little bit about the future, where things are going, especially the main trends. One of the things I like to say is that cities are shaped by the challenges they have to face. So one of the things we want to do is to look at what are the challenges that we're trying to overcome now. And once we overcome those challenges, that's going to tell us, how infrastructure will look like, because we've shaped the infrastructure to overcome those challenges. So there are tons of social challenges that we're facing right now, tons of social and public health. I mostly talk in terms of engineering, and in terms of engineering, there are really two big ones. It's sustainability and resilience. And a lot of the times when we think about those two, sustainability means low energy. So trying to use really as little energy as possible. That's one. And in terms of resilience is trying to better understand interdependency. So all those infrastructure systems that I discussed before, they all rely on one another to work. They're all interdependent, all of them. None of them work in silos. And right now, the way that they were designed is just like that. They were just designed with those interdependencies not really in mind. And now those interdependencies are limiting factors. They limit what we can do. They're weakness points. So what we can do is if we take into account those interdependencies, we can then make them enabling factors. So they can really strengthen our system as opposed to weakening the system. And the second one is adaptability. So trying to have infrastructure that's more adaptable. So in terms of the main trends, what I see in the literature, what I see when I talk to people, what's happening is for water, really the big one is conservation, try to conserve more water, especially in the US. We do consume a lot of water. It might not come to surprise that US is the highest consumer of water in the world. So conservation is probably the way to go. In terms of wastewater, it's green infrastructure and low impact development. That's transforming cities. By the way, I love the fact that cities are getting transformed everywhere in the world to deal with wastewater. It's like the least, with solid waste is probably the grossest type of infrastructure we can think of, but it's transforming cities in the world. And it's incredible. In terms of transport, it's accessibility. I didn't talk about accessibility, but right now we're thinking about accessibility. That means that, within not too far from where you live, you should have access to a lot of things. You should be able to have access to some grocery stores, to some jobs. You should have access, hopefully, to transit, as well to a car if you want to, as well to bicycle, as well to walk. So accessibility is very, very, very big. And that's both, favoring transit, active transportation, also as land use. So really rethinking land use. That's also going to ring a bell maybe to some of you when we think about food deserts. So food deserts are those especially low-income areas with no grocery stores there. And so people have to sometimes drive, take the bus for long hours or drive very far away to be able to buy food. And that's a very, very, very big problem. So accessibility in transport is the biggest thing that's coming. And we can talk about other things like mobility as a service, but I won't. In terms of electricity, it's all about renewable energy. Renewable. If any of you are pro fossil fuels, what I like to say is look at the biggest fossil fuel company in the world. Shell, BP, Total, except for Exxon in the US, I don't know why, but all the others, they're all transforming from fossil fuel companies to energy companies. They're all installing power plants like wind turbines, wind farms, solar farms. They're all doing it because they have the data and they know we're running out of fossil fuels. If the people who are experts are running away from that, I think it's a pretty good indication that we should run away from it too. And so renewable energy is really the way to go. We still have some technological problems that we have to face, and we'll solve them. But it's really the way to go, including in Texas. And they'll get to it. They don't have the choice. Texas, they might take a while, but they'll get to it. They'll use way more renewables at some point. I wouldn't be surprised actually if they flipped from being very fossil fuel heavy to renewable heavy. Gas is a fossil fuel. It's just going to disappear at some point. Probably not in the next few years, but it will disappear. It is a fossil fuel by definition. We can't sustain using it because it will disappear. It's just by definition. Not even an emissions thing. There's a finite quantity of gas. The more you take it, the less you have left. So at some point you will have to phase out. So at some point, gas is just gonna disappear. Solid waste, it's all about reduction and recycling. The US recycling rate is about 35%, which is okay. It's better than some countries, not that great. In Germany, it's all the way up at 60%. And telecom, I actually don't know. I don't know about telecom as much now. Is it going to be more or less? I think we're probably going to have way more telecom, but it's also less because we see the problems with social media and how it's affecting especially our mental health. So we might have less telecom in the future. The one thing I know is that telecom requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of electricity. And so telecom should be powered by renewables. And about the future, I can tell you one thing when it comes to infrastructure is that in the future, it should be a lot more multifunctional. So the way that we're building infrastructure now, most of it tends to have one single function. We're building a road a lot of times to carry traffic. We're building water treatment plants just to treat water. But there's a lot of things that we can do where infrastructure becomes multifunctional. Roads is a great example because roads have to deal with stormwater as well as traffic, and as well as in the ground, you also have electric lines. Sometimes you have water pipes, et cetera, et cetera. So making infrastructure multifunctional is really where the world is going right now. All right, that's all I have for you. I know I was very, very fast. I hope it was good. You're going to get access to the slides, so don't worry. And of course, you're more than welcome to email me just about any time. It's very easy, Darable, like terrible with a D. I always say I'm Dr. Darable. I'm the bad guy in a James Bond movie. I'm the villain, Dr. Darable. That's why I go by Sybil. So please, everyone just call me Sybil. And I'll be here to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Darable or Sybil. Very much appreciate this extremely informative presentation. I'm very glad that you chose engineering as your lifestyle. We know that it is also Engineering Week, and so thank you to you and to all of your colleagues that do all this important work. There's just so much for us to think about and just a lot to have learned. We've had a couple of questions that have come in. I'm going to combine one with a pre-question that we had, and then one that I saw in the chat. And you touched a little bit upon this when you were talking about our pipes. But the question is, what secures Chicago and the collar counties of Illinois from similar tragedy of what happened to the power grid in Texas?
Oh, that's a great question. So I know about electricity. I know something. I don't know everything. What I've heard is that the problem is not, there was a lot of political stuff that I don't want to discuss. But what I've heard is that there's been a lot of deregulation in Texas going on. That deregulation has really pushed prices to be as low as possible. And when you do that, you have to cut corners. You have to cut costs. And a lot of the infrastructure was not upgraded. There's just no way it could handle that kind of cold weather. That's why we have regulations to make sure that when bad things happen, the infrastructure can still can still work. One time I heard someone saying it's like toothpaste, if people can just provide you any toothpaste that they want, if there was no regulation, that would be pretty bad for your teeth. So some regulation is actually pretty good. And so that's my understanding, and especially Texas. So when you look at the US, it's got 3 major power grids. So the power grid, so every US states tend to be interconnected with one another. We tend to have the Eastern grid, which is Chicago all the way down to Florida. It's one big, so then this way we can distribute power when it's needed. Then we have the Rocky Mountains that are kind of blocking things. So we have the Eastern on one side, the Western grid on the other side. So some Western states, including California. And then Texas is like, screw you. I want to be by myself. I don't want to follow all those federal regulations. I'm going to be by myself. And so they did, and they did, and it works, I guess, okay most of the time. But when something happened, like it happened last week, it completely failed. And that's really my understanding is that it's really a regulations problem. Even if it was purely wind, it would not have been better. If it was purely natural gas, it probably would not have been better. It's really a matter of spending the money to make sure that it's running. It's yeah, just to make sure. I mean, I know there's some engineers here. I mean, infrastructure is not cheap, but we need it as a society to survive.
It'll be interesting to see what the response is after this now and where the demands are for where money should be spent in Texas and how they want to adjust perhaps.
That's a cultural thing. Someone told me from Texas that that Texans prefer to be the heroes coming after a crisis as opposed to adopt sound planning. So if nothing happened because the infrastructure was good, there would not be any heroes. So I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know. I don't know Texans enough. If you know you're in Texas now, or if you know Texans, tell me if it's true. But I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either, but it's super interesting. Maybe one more quick question. And you, again, sort of at the end had touched a little bit upon this, but the question is, some people say that Chicago doesn't really recycle the items collected from the blue bins. Do you think, or do you know if that's true? And the same thing has been said about leaves that are put in brown paper bags. And I know I heard you say that 35% is our percentage of what we recycle, but I'm not sure.
That's actually a great question, and I don't have the answer. I don't know what's happening. The only thing I can tell you is that the solid waste management world is something I learned about maybe 4 years ago. It's way more fascinating than you think. Most of the time, the regulations for solid waste management is done at the federal level, but it's all left at the purview of the local governments. And so it's really local governments that have to talk to one another. A lot of times you want to do things in region because nobody wants waste and you want to pool in some efforts. And so trying to come up with solid waste management strategies is not that easy. In Japan in the 1970s, you actually had the garbage war. So garbage was just piling up. Nobody would know where it would go. So I would just say, I don't know. I know it's more complicated than it looks. Maybe there's some dirty money at the back as well. I mean, we are in Illinois. These things happen. But I don't know. But I know it's more complicated than you think. But it is fascinating. So I encourage all of you to know more about the solid waste management world.
Well, thank you so much. And I have to just throw this in there, as a born and raised Chicagoan, we will always call it the Sears Tower because that's just like our Chicago hot dogs. You don't put ketchup on them. It is how it is. But in all seriousness, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and presentation. We're excited to see your book and hopefully be able to read it. And I saw somebody in the chat say, can we have a part 2? So hopefully it'll be interested in coming back at some point and doing another presentation with us. But thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And just to close this out, please join us next Wednesday, March 3rd at noon for our next Alumni Exchange event, when we will be joined by UIC alumna Angie Palo, who has become a real estate agent to promote her community, which is in Pilsen, as she shares with us the main steps in purchasing a home as she presents Home Buying 101. To find a recording of our past episodes, including this one, please do go to go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that quick survey that I mentioned at the beginning. And let us know your thoughts. We always appreciate that. Thank you again, Sybil, for this wonderful conversation, discussion, and presentation today. We're so grateful to you and so glad that you're a member of our faculty at UIC. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future UIC Alumni Exchange program. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.